But morality for most people is a mix of this emotional impulse and the rational layer that we will pause and reflect. And the rational layer without the emotional impulse is, for most people, relatively weak, not for everybody.
My conversational partner today, I hope he doesn't mind me saying, is widely regarded by journalists and alike as the world's most influential living philosopher. Peter is the founder of The Life You Can Save, an organization based on his book of the same name. You may know Peter from works such as Animal Liberation, Practical Ethics, The Most Good You Can Do, Ethics in the Real World, and many more. Peter, thank you so much for joining me on the Freedom Pact podcast today.
You're very welcome.
It's a pleasure, sir. So I wanted to start off, I mentioned the Life You Can Save. In the preface of the latest edition, you ask the reader to consider if they are drinking a bottle of water or a can of soda while reading the book, offering that if they are, then they probably have money to spend on things they don't need when there are 700 million or so people struggling to live every day on less money than that product would cost. Now, when I read that, I realized that that's something I would have never thought of unless you pointed it out to me in the book. So why do you think that we are so ignorant or unaware of this kind of thinking without someone like yourself having to point it out to us?
Well, I think in a way that's the role of philosophers and thinkers, to stand back a little bit from our everyday life and patterns of living and patterns of consumption, and maybe contrast them with others that we're not so aware of in our daily life, and then ask questions about them. So, as I say, I think we're not aware of this because this is the society we're brought up in. This is what all our friends do and our family does. So we just take it as absolutely normal. And people living in extreme poverty, we don't see. I mean, occasionally they may come across on something that, like television or something, that a video that some friend refers us to. But, if you're living in an affluent country, if you're living in the United Kingdom or Australia or the United States, essentially there aren't really people in extreme poverty as the World Bank defines it in those countries. There are certainly people who are relatively much poorer than average people in those countries. But, just on what the welfare state provides in the United Kingdom, you're already significantly above that extreme poverty line. Plus, of course, you have free healthcare, you have safe water that comes out of the tap. If you're a child, you will be able to go to school free. All of those things that we just take for granted in these countries, that not everybody in the world has.
I think long-time listeners of this show will be familiar with the drowning child analogy. We've pondered it on the show before with other guests who have brought it up. But on that topic, why, if you can explain to our audience, why is suffering that happens right before our eyes more or seemingly more important to us? And is there any moral difference between something that happens right in front of us that we can instantly impact and something happening on the other side of the world?
Well, to answer the first question, why is it more important to us? You have to realize that we're the products of millions of years of evolution, as evolving as social mammals all of this time, and eventually evolving as human social mammals. And during all this time, we lived in relatively small groups. Our closest ancestors, chimpanzees and bonobos, still live in relatively small groups, and some humans do as well. And people who study this believe that probably for most of our evolutionary history, humans lived in groups of maybe 150 or so, but not a lot more. So you got to see everybody, you got to know every face that you're with, and you relate to those people. And because we're social mammals, we respond to people's appeals for help if they're members of our social group. So when we see a child in front of us, even if that child is not actually somebody we know, I think we still have that innate response of, here's somebody I see and they're in need and I could help them. So, you know, we have a strong, not necessarily always acted upon, we have a strong impulse to help. But we never, during all of that evolutionary past, had the opportunity to save people who were distant, who we couldn't see. So we just didn't have the means to do that. Now, very recently, in the last century or two, we have the ability to do that. But, you know, we haven't had time to evolve any kind of emotional response to it. We have this more intellectual response, if you like, a rational understanding of the needs of others and of our ability to help. But, you know, morality for most people is a mix of this emotional impulse and the rational layer that, you know, we will pause and reflect. And the rational layer without the emotional impulse is, for most people, relatively weak. Not for everybody, but you know, compared to the strength of the emotional impulses, it's quite often weak. So I think that's the explanation of why we don't feel the same about knowing that there's a child somewhere else whose life we could save, as we would if the child was in front of us. Now, do I think that that makes a moral difference, that psychological difference? Yes and no. I think because we understand why people act the way they do, we shouldn't sort of really heavily blame people for preferring to save the child in front of them, or being more likely to save the child in front of them than to save the distant stranger. But if we ask the question, is it wrong not to save the distant stranger? I think the answer to that has to be yes. If you can, you know, quite easily save that distant stranger at the same cost as the cost of replacing the clothes when you jump into the pond and save the child, then I think it's wrong not to do so. If you know about that and you have the assets to spare. But as I say, the question of praising and blaming people is somewhat separate, because it has to take into account of what we regard as normal human behavior.
Yeah, for sure. So in that sense, so we've posed this question before on the show. If I'm walking down the street on my way to work and I reject a charity appeal, you know, it seems legitimate, but I say I haven't got time and I carry on walking. You know, I don't want to spare that few pound instantly. But then on the way to work, I maybe stop at a local coffee shop and buy a overly expensive coffee to perk me up on my way to work. Is that immoral?
Well, I tend to brush past the charities that wave the can under my nose on the street, because I don't know enough about them. You know, you said it seems to be legitimate. Maybe it is legitimate, but legitimate is not enough for me. I don't want to give my money just to any charity that's not actually a fraud, a scam, a ripoff. I want to give my money to the charity that will do the most good with what I decide to give. And that you can't tell unless you can pull up some research that's been done on it by other people, because, you know, you don't have the time to do that. It's a very serious study. So, you know, fortunately, there are organizations that can do that research, and organizations that can aggregate research from different think tanks that do it. So the Life You Can Save, which, as you mentioned at the beginning, is a charity that I founded, is one of these aggregators of research that others do. And so we recommend about 20 highly effective charities. And I recommend that you give to those, not to the ones that you don't know very much about as you walk down the street. But let's get back to your highly expensive coffee. Look, you know, maybe you really need this coffee to perk up and work well during your office day. And if you don't work well, you're not going to keep your job, or you're not going to earn as much, or something like that. So, you know, I'm not going to say you can't have the coffee, but there, you know, there may be some other luxury that you spend your money on that in no way is going to improve your ability to earn money and to give. And maybe then yeah, you could think about that. And again, I'm not saying you have to give up every luxury, but if you're not giving something significant to a highly effective charity, then and you are spending money on things you don't really need, you're above that level of income where you only can just cover your real needs, yeah, then I think you are doing something wrong.
For our audience who are completely new to this topic and this kind of thinking, can you define effective altruism and sort of speak on its marriage between head and heart?
Yeah, sure. So effective altruism is a relatively new movement, began about a dozen years ago, and it, to some extent draws on what I've been saying just now and some of these things I had said in earlier articles going back more than 40 years. That is that we can help people who are in extreme poverty and in great need at very little cost to us. There will be some financial cost, but I would argue that in terms of real cost, that is in terms of our life being worse because of it, there's either practically none, or sometimes even it's positive because you feel happier about knowing you're doing good. So that's the sort of argument for being altruistic. But what happened in the early 2000s is that some people started doing some real research on how to do the most good, and started looking at how to get the best value for what you're doing. So I think then we got the effective part of altruism coming in. This idea that you want to get the best value for whatever you do that's altruistic, which may be donating money. It might be your choice of career. You might say, I want my, if you're at the point where you're choosing a career, you might say, I want my life's work to be doing good for the world. So, that's another thing you have to think about, which career is going to do the most good for the world. It might be that you're going to volunteer some hours each day to a non-profit organization. And again, you need to think about which one will do the most good. So that's what effective altruism is all about. It's about bringing this kind of, if you like, somewhat cost-benefit kind of thinking into your altruism. And as you suggested, so that brings together, I think, for many people, both the head and the heart, because it's the heart that makes us look at the needs of others and say, oh, this is terrible that people have to live in such desperate poverty, and that they, may not be able to have their child treated if she's ill because they can't afford to pay for the doctor and there's no free health service in the area, or they can't afford to educate their children, so they don't send all their children to school. So, if that appeals to your feeling that there's something bad about this and you'd like to help these people, then the head has to come in and saying yes, and try to help people in the most effective way so that whatever resources you've got, they will do the most good, help the most people.
I'd love to give people listening right now a popular example that they could maybe relate this to. So where does someone like Bill Gates rank among the effective altruists that our world has to offer? Is he someone that would be right at the top, in your opinion?
Yes, I rate Bill Gates very highly, because, sure, he has a vast amount of money, and sure, even after he's given, I'm not sure what the current figure is, it's at least $30 billion, and that's probably a bit outdated, and I think he's giving more, and certainly my understanding is that he and Melinda Gates plan to give most of their wealth to the Gates Foundation eventually. So he'll be giving a very large amount of money. And the other thing is, he's giving it effectively. He has thought hard, and he is continuing to think hard about how to do that most effectively. He stepped down from running Microsoft to run the Gates Foundation and get together a lot of people to help him think about how to do this best. And mostly what he's doing is related to global poverty and is related to global health. He says that he was shocked to discover that a virus that causes diarrhea, it's called the rotavirus, kills millions of children each year, when we know how to cure this, and we also know how to prevent it by providing safe drinking water. So the Gates Foundation set out to do this. It also vaccinates children against measles. Again, these are not rocket science. We know how to do it, but we just hadn't put the resources into doing it. And he's also then trying to find a vaccine for malaria, which is a more difficult scientific problem. But so I think he's thought hard about how to be really effective. So I rate him highly, both because of the quantity of money he's given and the effectiveness. Now, somebody might say, look, even after Gates has given 30 billion, 60 billion or whatever, he hasn't given, he's still a billionaire probably, if not, he's a multi-millionaire, sure. So you might say, so, shouldn't we really be admiring the person who's living on the old age pension and yet still finds the ability to give something to an effective charity each week? And yeah, there's a sense in which, we do admire that greatly. But, you have to take account of the fact that Gates has resisted a world in which says billionaires lavish their money on all sorts of things that don't do any good and don't usually spend much of their time or much of their money on trying to do the most good they can.
Who are some other examples of effective altruists that may come to mind other than Bill Gates that you could offer us? Yeah,
so there's certainly a lot, and they're not all super wealthy like that. So I've talked about quite a few in a book I've written called The Most Good You Can Do. And so give some examples. I got an email out of the blue a few years ago from somebody who had taken a moral philosophy class in which the article we were talking about, Famine, Affluence and Morality, is called, the one that has the drowning child in the shallow pond, and came up for discussion. And they, as well as reading that, they read an argument that said, well, it can't be the case that we have an obligation to do good if it doesn't really harm us much, because if that were the case, then we should all be giving away one of our kidneys, because people die on waiting lists while they're waiting for kidneys. So this was supposed to be a refutation of the argument, trading on the assumption that, obviously, so it can't be the case that we have to give away a kidney. But this student, Chris Croy is his name, thought this through and said, well, yeah, if it's really true that it doesn't hurt, doesn't harm you much to give away a kidney and it saves people's lives, that is what we should do. And he studied up on this. He found that the risks of donating a kidney are actually very, very small, and decided that that's what he would do, and did donate a kidney to a complete stranger, not to a friend or family. Just went to a hospital, persuaded them that he was serious, and donated a kidney. And he's not the only person who's done that. I know others who've done that as well. So, that's a very powerful form of altruism. I have to admit, I don't have any problems giving away significant amounts of money, but I still do have 2 kidneys. Probably I'm getting to the age now where nobody would really want one of my kidneys, but I could have done this much younger, and I didn't. So, I really admire people who are prepared to do that.
We mentioned Bill Gates there and billionaires. I often see this argument come up in podcasts, debates lately, and it's this question: is it immoral to be a billionaire and hold so much of the world's wealth when others are in poverty? Or, in your opinion, does it boil down to that case-by-case analysis of what they do with the money?
Yeah, I think you have to distinguish 2 separate questions, right? One question is, should we have an economic system and a tax system in which it's possible to become and remain a billionaire? And I think there's a very good case for saying, no, we should not. We should have different kinds of economies and different kinds of tax systems that make sure that wealth is more evenly distributed. So that's one question, and that's my answer to that. But a separate question is, suppose we don't have a system that makes it impossible to become a billionaire. Suppose we have a system which in fact means that there are quite a few billionaires and some who are, billionaires 10 times, even 50 times. I think Jeff Bezos may be getting around 100 times over. So in that situation, is it immoral to be a billionaire? No, I think the answer is it depends on what you do with your billions. And if what you do with your billions is think carefully about how best to use them to do the most good in the world, then you're not doing anything immoral. And I think Bill Gates has done that. There are others. For example, Dustin Moskovitz and Carrie Tuna are a couple who are billionaires because Dustin Moskovitz was one of the co-founders of Facebook, and he's also gone on and with other computer startups that have been successful. So they started a foundation called Good Ventures, and they're funding a project called Open Philanthropy, which is doing research on this question of how can we do the most good with our resources. So basically the effective altruism question. And that's a very serious question. There's lots of research that you can do to find the answers and to think about the answers. So they are giving away lots of money. As far as I know, they've still got $1 billion or more, so they're still billionaires. But I think they're going about it the right way in terms of getting rid of that, doing the most good with it. And I'm sure they'll end up not being billionaires anymore because they've given away the great majority of what they had.
A guy you mentioned there, you mentioned Jeff Bezos, obviously the richest man on the planet, holds most of the wealth, but obviously a disgustingly rich man. And there are questions around his approach to taxes. If there's loopholes he can find, he takes them. But I was speaking to a friend about Jeff Bezos the other week, and they said that they didn't see a problem with it because even though he's a very rich man, he provides a service that in its own way helps a lot of people. They posed the argument that if their child all of a sudden needed new shoes for school tomorrow, they could use his service and they could acquire them within hours. It could be at their door the next day, and that in that way that he does help a lot of people. Where do you weigh in on Jeff Bezos, and in his case, is what he does in terms of tax, even though it's legal, is that immoral?
I don't think we should try to cut corners with tax. I think taxation is a responsibility that everybody should pay. We all use government services. We all need things that the government provides. And I think we should not feel that this is money that we have to try and somehow evade paying, but rather that we should pay up as our share of it, and that share should be not, I should say, artificially reduced by clever tax dodgers. On the other hand, and there are other things you could criticize Jeff Bezos for. There are questions about what workers are paid in working for Amazon, and perhaps that could be changed too. And the third thing I would say is that he, even if you accept that Amazon does provide valuable services, and I agree with that, I think it does. I think it's made various things much more accessible to people. We still have to ask, what is he doing with his money? Now, he has become more sensitive perhaps to the criticism that he had in the past not been donating much of it to good causes, and he has started donating to issues like climate change, for example, which I agree is a very important issue. But I think it's still a much smaller fraction of his wealth than Buffett or Gates or Moskovitz and Tuna have donated. So I'd like to see him doing much more. And I'd like to see him thinking perhaps more carefully about how it does the most good.
There may be people listening to this right now and they're thinking, Peter, Lewis, I'm not a billionaire. I work 40 hours a week. I earn minimum wage. you know, I can make ends meet, but I can barely enjoy my life more so than that. What are the questions that you would encourage these people to ponder and ask themselves?
Well, I would invite them to ask themselves, so am I spending money on things that I just don't need? And you know, that's where you started off with the bottled water, right? Well, if you live in a country where safe drinking water comes out of the tap for free, then you don't need to buy bottled water. So you know, you could put that aside, and you could say, okay, so I'll stop buying bottled water and maybe, you know, sodas and things as well, and I'll see how much that adds up to at the end of the month, and I'll donate that to some effective charity. And you know, then obviously you'll get by just as well as you did before. So, and I think you know, I can't speak for everyone, but I think a lot of people will say that they will feel good about what they're doing. They'll feel better about their lives because they know they are contributing to making the world a better place. And there's psychological research that, you know, shows that people who are generous are more satisfied with their lives. So I don't think it's really costing them in that sense. Now, there may be some people who will say, no, you know, I don't earn enough to buy bottled water. I always drink water that comes out of the tap. And I don't really have other frivolous luxuries that I spend money on either. So, okay, I mean, not everybody can donate to significantly. You may have some time you can donate, perhaps. But yeah, I'm really pitching this at people who do spend some money on things that there's no way of arguing that they really need these things.
As we move into the next topic, more so around the Penguin Great Ideas release of the book, Why Vegan, I'll first ask, is it any less morally significant for animals to suffer than humans? And if no, why do you think that most people in the world don't see it that way?
So my answer is, if the suffering is similar, then it's not more significant that it's occurring in a human than a non-human. Now, people may say, well, how can it be similar, right? Humans have this greater awareness of themselves, greater self-awareness. They anticipate the future more than non-human animals do. They have memories maybe that are different from those of non-human animals. And very often that's true, although, you know, sometimes we exaggerate the differences, and it may depend on what the non-human animal is. But there are some humans who don't have this ability to predict the future or these clear memories. And in fact, that's all of us when we're, let's say, less than 3 months old. You know, we don't have language. We clearly don't know very much about what's going on, but we do have a nervous system. We do suffer, you know, we suffer if we're hungry, we suffer if we're cold, we suffer if somebody stands on our fingers accidentally. So think about those kinds of suffering in a human being, like a very young human being. And then think about similar suffering in a non-human animal who can also be hungry, cold, can have, well, maybe not fingers, but, you know, paw trodden on. And I think that kind of suffering is really equivalent. You know, it matters just as much. Again, I'm assuming that there's no lasting injury that is going to affect the child for the rest of the child's life. But let's say it's a physical pain which is going to be there for a few minutes or even hours, and then we'll go. I think it's just as significant whether it happens to a human or an animal. Now, you said, well, why don't we think that? I think the answer to that is fairly obvious. You know, we are familiar with in-group, out-group distinctions in human history, and fortunately, many of them we now reject. Right? But if you had asked a white American living in Mississippi in 1820, let's say, do you think the suffering of, well, I won't use the word they will use, but the suffering of an African American, let's say we would use that, say, is as important or significant as the suffering of a white person, they would also answer no, without much thought. And I think that, you know, in that case we have as racism, and we now reject that, although we know racism still exists, of course, in our society. But you know, when we talk about it, most decent people don't own up to saying, yes, I think the suffering of a person of my race matters a lot more than the similar suffering of a person of another race. So I think what goes on between humans and animals is analogous. It's not identical, but there's an in-group, a powerful in-group, which gives itself a higher moral status and attributes more significance to what happens to it than it attributes to the out-group. And in this case, the in-group is all human beings, and the out-group is all non-human sentient animals.
What would you, so the people who oppose the vegan approach, they're very, you know, very loud and passionate people, and you hear all these arguments they typically tend to throw the same arguments. But what would you say to those people that say things such as, well, you know, a lion doesn't think twice about, you know, slaughtering a gazelle, or this is the way it's always been, or these sort of cliche arguments? What would you say to those people that offer that approach?
Well, you know, this is the way it's always been is an argument that has been used in other cases where we now certainly emphatically reject it, right? I mean, the idea, for example, that men lead groups and make decisions and that women are excluded. You don't have to go very far back. You know, you're in the United Kingdom, right? You only have to go back to the mid-19th century, and women didn't have the vote. John Stuart Mill put a motion to Parliament in, I don't know exactly when, 1865, something like that maybe, that voting reform should remove the word man and replace it with the word person. And he knew it was not going to pass. I mean, it didn't. He was quite surprised that it got 60 or 70 votes, I think. So, you know, it was just automatically assumed that, well, look, it's always been the way that men have led societies and women don't. And that was supposed to be justification. Now, we don't think that way anymore. And similarly, I think the fact that something has always been this way, that, you know, we've eaten meat, let's say, which is not completely true of all societies and all times, but it's certainly true of most humans at most times. That's no justification for saying that it should continue to be that way, especially if we now have the knowledge and the ability to nourish ourselves well from products not using animals. And if we know that the commercial methods of producing animal foods are ruthless and don't really consider the interest of animals, you know, except where you have to or they'll die and you won't make a profit. You know, and then we haven't even talked about the climate effects of animal products. So, you know, there's a whole lot of things that we now know that people didn't know, and opportunities we have that people didn't have. And I think that changes things. And I think we shouldn't rely on this argument that it's always been like this, because maybe it has been like this, but it's certainly time to change it, and it's important to change it.
So in a hypothetical world in which humans didn't have any other viable food source, where, you know, we couldn't get the correct nourishment from our environment, from our surroundings, like plants, in that case, would the slaughtering and eating of animals be justified?
I think you could argue that if we were going to die without it, we would be justified in doing that. Yes, obviously we still ought to do it in the most humane way possible, in ways that give the animals good lives, not the squalid, confined lives of animals in factory farms today. But it gives them good lives and then kills them painlessly without them having foreknowledge or awareness of what's going to happen to them. I think we could argue that that was defensible if we really needed it to survive ourselves.
I was reading an argument online this morning that says that chimpanzees are comparable to 3-year-old humans in their capacity for self-awareness, problem solving, their emotional lives, and that some ask, how can we assign rights to, or the basic rights to children, but not to these chimpanzees? And how would you weigh in on that?
You know, I think that's essentially correct, that it's not really justified to say humans have rights. You know, we talk about human rights a lot, but humans have rights, but no non-human animal has these rights. I think we should extend basic rights to non-human animals, and a good place to start if we're doing this would be chimpanzees, or chimpanzees and bonobos and great apes and maybe orangutans, because these are the animals not only that we are most closely related to in genetic terms, but also the animals who are most like us in terms of their capacities to think, their strong emotional bonds with other members of their group. They're clearly, you know, living with certain long-term expectations of things that are happening and the memories of the past. You know, you only have to read the wonderful studies by Jane Goodall and many others since, and not only about chimpanzees, but about other great apes. And you can see that their lives do resemble ours more closely than many people have thought. So I think to try to narrow the gulf between humans and non-human animals, that's something we ought to do. And maybe starting with the great apes is a good way to do that, to show that, you know, there's really close connections. When we talk about humans on the one hand and then animals on the other, we're sort of implying that there's this big gulf between humans and all animals. But in fact, we're much more closely related to a chimpanzee than a chimpanzee is to a dog, you know, in genetic terms. So it's not like there's all humans here and all non-human animals there. It's like there's a whole continuum of relationships, and to some extent a continuum of cognitive abilities, but more important still is the capacity to suffer and to feel pain and to enjoy their lives, which a very large number of animals have.
At the top of the conversation, I pointed out that some people regard you as, you know, an extremely influential philosopher, and a lot of people I've seen online attribute the moral awakening moment to reading your work. Do you remember personally for you a moment or an event that happened that flipped that switch for you?
Well, certainly a crucial event in my not only in my ethical thinking, but also in my decision to actually live according to my ethical ideas, occurred when I was a graduate student at Oxford University in 1970. So I was 24 years old already at this point, and I, as I say, I was studying philosophy. I was interested in ethics, but purely by chance, I got into a conversation after a class with a Canadian graduate student who suggested we continue the conversation over lunch. He invited me to Balliol, the college that he was at, and we went in for lunch, and there was a choice of two dishes. There was one hot dish and a salad plate, and the hot dish was spaghetti with a kind of brown sauce poured over it. So Richard Keshen, as this student was, asked if there was meat in the spaghetti sauce, and when he was told there was, he took the salad plate. So I didn't, you know, I wasn't going to be satisfied with a cold salad. I wanted a hot dish. So I took the spaghetti, and we continued our conversation about whatever it was. But then eventually, when that petered out, I said, "So what's your problem with me?" Now, you know, you have to think back to the early 1970s, when there were very, very few vegetarians around, and most of the vegetarians who were around, they might have religious reasons. They might be a Hindu, for example. They might be an absolute pacifist who thought all killing was wrong, or they might think that meat was bad for your health. And I don't think I would have responded to any of those reasons, right? I was not going to be a pacifist, because I do think you have to defend yourself sometimes if you're attacked. For example, it was right to defend yourself against Nazism in the Second World War. I certainly not a Hindu, and I, you know, I don't think that, and maybe it's true that most people eat too much meat and too many animal products for their health, but I don't think eating modest amounts of meat is really going to be that damaging to your health. But Richard didn't say any of those things. He said, so I don't think it's right to treat the animals the way we're treating them in order to turn them into meat. And I really didn't know very much about this. Right? And as I say, younger people listening to this today have to think themselves back to a very different time period. Because I didn't know about factory farms at all. I still imagined that the animals I was eating had had good lives out in the fields, and then eventually had been rounded up, trucked to slaughter and killed. And I knew that, that was a bad thing. I'd been on the road behind trucks going to slaughter, and you could see the animals packed together. It looked horrible. But I thought, well, they've had good lives. They're now having a few bad hours, and they'll be dead. So I didn't really think that it was a whole lifetime of bad lives that they were having. But Richard said, oh, you ought to learn more about this. And he mentioned the one book that had been written at this time, a book by Ruth Harrison called Animal Machines. And it was very persuasive. I found it's now somewhat dated, but I think it would still be persuasive if you pick it up. That essentially, I think Ruth Harrison had a line that went something like, cruelty is acknowledged only when profitability is affected. So, you can do anything that you can do to an animal that won't harm productivity is going to be done. And certainly that's how it was in 1970. And largely it's still how it is, although there have been some laws passed in the European Union and the UK to restrict some of the practices that I criticised in the first edition of Animal Liberation. And I should say it was that conversation that led me, after about another 5 years, to write Animal Liberation. So that was a turning point for me, certainly in terms of what I was eating, in terms of putting ethics into practice in my life, and it affected other things as well. I think it affected. It was around that time I wrote the article about the drowning child in the pond in 1971. It was published in 72. So you can see that things are going on during my graduate years at Oxford that are leading me to make ethics more applied and also make it more challenging, more demanding, and to put it into practice in my own life.
You've edited a forthcoming edition of The Golden Ass, the only surviving Roman novel in its entirety. I believe when this podcast airs, that will already be released. This is something I'm really looking forward to because I've never read it. I've got no knowledge of it, so I'm really looking forward to when this comes out so I can check it out for the first time. But for those who are in the similar position to me, where they're unaware of the work, can you give us maybe one important lesson, theme, or takeaway from this work that you'd like to share and make people aware of?
Yeah, the theme, following up what we were just talking about, is what is life like for a donkey? So a donkey in Roman times was regarded as a rather lowly creature. They were not as noble as horses, but they were worked very hard, and they were mistreated in various kinds of ways. And this novel is about a man who is turned into a donkey and therefore experiences the life of a donkey and describes, in his own times, this is written in the 2nd century of the Common Era, so in the Roman Empire heyday, and he describes a lot of things that happen, not just being beaten to make donkeys carry heavy loads up steep mountains, being tormented for fun by young boys, for example, but also, and in a way this is more analogous to what I was talking about, what we do to animals in factory farms today, essentially being a slave turning a mill. So growing the corn, they used animals, donkeys and horses to walk endlessly in circles inside in a dark place. They put blinkers on them so they wouldn't be distracted or walk anywhere else. They beat them if they didn't walk and turn the mill. And then when they'd done that, they'd lock them away and gave them just enough food to keep them working. So, here is an animal being exploited as if it were just a machine to make profits for the miller. And there were also slaves in these mills as well. So you get a vivid picture of the human slaves and the animal slaves being exploited together. So, that's the kind of lesson you asked about that people should take away. But I don't want people to get the idea this is going to be a grim read. In fact, it's a very funny book. There's lots of amusing things that happen. It's a kind of adventurous book because the donkey is in great peril at various moments and manages to escape. And it's also quite an erotic book because there are sex scenes in it as well, which I won't describe now, but your listeners can explore for themselves. So I think it's a great read. And, I also, despite my interest in animals, had not read it until not that many years ago. And when I did read it, I thought this work ought to be better known. But part of the obstacle to it being well known was that it had a lot of digressions. The donkey with the big ears the donkey had overheard a lot of stories. And so the donkey retells all these stories. Some of them are interesting, but you lose the thread of the main narrative, I thought. So I thought this needs an edition that prunes away these digressions and lets the kind of adventures of the donkey really stand out at the center. And that's what my edition does. I got a great translator to do a lively, fresh, modern translation, Professor Ellen Finkelperl. And I got a couple of illustrators, Russian sisters, to do a great set of illustrations for it as well. So I'm really happy with the way it's come out. It's probably the most entertaining book that I've written for many years. I didn't write it, of course, but I've produced for many years.
I look forward to it. Look, I've got 3 final questions for you today that we ask every guest that comes on the show. The first one, we've cited a lot of your books today. We've mentioned that they've had, big impact on other people's lives. You've mentioned one already, but can you give us maybe 2 or 3 books that have had a major impact on your life?
On my own life? Well, I've already mentioned Ruth Harrison's Animal Machines, which had a very big impact. So, and I've talked a bit about evolution and the importance of understanding evolution in terms of understanding how we are as we are. So, there's different books you could look at there. I want to give credit to Richard Dawkins' work on evolution, starting off with The Selfish Gene, and of course there's The Blind Watchmaker as well, and other books, which I think put this out very well. But ultimately, of course, you have to go back to Charles Darwin, and particularly, although he wrote The Origin of Species first, for its application to humans, The Descent of Man is still a wonderful book and still a terrific read. So that's another good one. I'd also like to mention Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which has been somewhat criticized. But I think even if there are particular claims that you can object to, I think still does a valuable service in indicating that, it's not all doom and gloom. We've actually made great progress in the world in the past century or so. There are, there've never been as high a proportion of the world's population not in poverty, living as there is now. Maybe I shouldn't say now because COVID certainly hasn't helped, but as there was in 2019, let's say, and let's hope we'll get back to that. Never been as many people able to read and write, never as many people able to get some healthcare, all of those things. So I think that's Pinker's book is a very valuable antidote to the kind of doom and gloom view.
I apologize. The last 2 questions I have may be quite hard for a philosopher to answer. The first one is, if every person on the planet was tuned into the same frequency and you were given the opportunity to broadcast one message or one particular lesson that you would love every person on the planet to hear just once, what would Peter Singer's message to the world be?
So if I have to just put this in a sentence, I would say, think about the consequences of your choices. Choices of what to eat, choices of what you do with your resources, choices of how you live. Think about them for everyone affected by your actions, all sentient beings now and into the future, as far as we can predict what the future consequences of those actions will be.
Love it. The last question, our answers to this one range from everything from family, loved ones, friends, to their work, to their mission. And again, I imagine this is probably a hard one for you to answer. It's probably a philosopher's life work. But for Peter Singer, what makes a life worth living?
I find a life worth living if you enjoy your life. Happiness is important, and worth living is one where you get that happiness, or at least some of it, out of knowing that you've lived a good life in terms of your values and in terms of making the world as good a place as you possibly can.
Beautiful. We've mentioned your work, your books, your organization. Please let these guys know where they can find out more about those projects and find yourself.
Sure. Well, I do have a website, which is petersinger.info, I-N-F-O. You can find out more about what I'm writing, what I've been doing, future events there. Please also go to thelifeyoucansave.org, which is the charity, as you mentioned, that I founded. And there you can download a copy of the book, The Life You Can Save, the updated edition, absolutely free, either as an ebook or as an audiobook. And the audiobook is read by celebrities, including Stephen Fry, Kristen Bell, Paul Simon, so some familiar people. And they all donated their services because they believe in the book. So that's the second place that I would like you to go. And if you're interested in animal charities and finding out what are the best animal charities, Animal Charity Evaluators does something for animal charities, a bit like what The Life You Can Save does for human charities. And there's one more thing that I'll mention that we haven't talked about. I'm concerned about the narrowing of freedom of discussion and the fact that some people may be intimidated from publishing their ideas because of the kind of harassment that has been around. So I've co-founded a journal called the Journal of Controversial Ideas, which is about to publish the first issue. In fact, it may be, for all I know, it's going up as we're speaking, because I'm not the one actually putting the articles online. But it certainly should be up, if not today, then tomorrow. So you go to journalofcontroversialideas.org and have a look at the first issue if you're curious about that project.
That sounds amazing. I will link all the websites and work you mentioned there in the show notes of this episode, so everyone can go and find them easily. Peter, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute honor to speak to you, and it's a conversation that has got me thinking and will leave me a lot to think about. So thank you so much for bringing the value to the podcast today.
You're very welcome, Lewis, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to all your viewers and listeners.